The Sophists were teachers in ancient Greece who used rhetoric and philosophy for the purpose of teaching arete, or virtue, to young statesmen. Their peculiar cultural relativism was an attempt at simultaneously assigning a coherent set of meanings to vocabulary and understanding how to live well, and more specifically effectively, in a city-state. Success in this respect was to be effective within the public forums, which meant that one needed to conform to the prevailing conventions as to what is and is not just. The Sophists did not therefore believe in a criterion for justice and virtue as such, rather that to be just and virtuous was simply to be successful. This type of philosophy necessitates a certain level of social discrimination, since wisdom was held to be available only to those of noble and wealthy stead. It was this fact that led to the condemnations of the Sophists made by Socrates. The most recognisable Sophist sentiment is most clearly explicated by one of its chief thinkers, Protagoras, born in 490 BCE. Protagoras said, "Man is the measure of all things, of the things which are, that they are, and of the things which are not, that they are not." Protagoras is here espousing a general and indeed ethical relativism. As things seem to be to an individual, so they are to him. There is no being hot, just seeming hot. A thing is whatever it appears to be, and not what it does not. This is a simple yet peculiar concept. One way to bring out this peculiarity is to consider it in terms of moral and intellectual values, where all men are equal in respect to the truth. How does Protagoras view his position as a teacher if he has not the right of such a superior position? It is that Protagoras claims that some judgments can be more effective than others, even though they must be equal in terms of their truth. Therefore, the relationship between the truth of a judgment and its effectiveness is irrelevant. The Sophists distinguished nature and convention in that they held moral virtues to be relative to respective states. The question, what is justice, is not a meaningful one, since the answers to the questions, what is justice in Athens and what is justice in Rome, are not necessarily the same. The conventional man is one who conforms to the standards of his state, while the natural man is one who depends only upon his own private purposes, being at home equally in any state. The natural man lies at the core of all men, but it is up to the individual to decide whether to accept and identify morality with that which is considered conventional. Of course, the natural man is not actually devoid of social conventions, but only adherence to convention. He is therefore merely a man from a previous culture whose previously acceptable actions make him appear as an aggressive outsider. His character belongs to a vocabulary drawn from social life. Selfishness, aggressiveness, and so on are defined in terms of the established norms. When there are no norms, there can be no failing to come up to them. What the Sophists failed to distinguish was the difference between the concept of a man who stands outside of and can question one given social life, and the concept of a man who stands outside of social life altogether. Thus, the Sophists see the natural man as a man who is simply out to get power, putting the conventional vocabulary to his private purposes. It is on this point that Socrates seeks to present an alternative. The task of delineating the historical Socrates is of course not one without controversy, but this problem can be largely avoided by painting a composite portrait of him from two palettes. The first is Aristotle's account of Socrates in the Metaphysics, where Aristotle, unlike Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, seems to have no axe of personal interest to grind. For Aristotle, Socrates was occupied with the excellences of human character, and syllogizing from definitions. He syllogized from what Aristotle calls inductive arguments, which are simply arguments which invoke examples with the intention of convincing his interlocutors of inability to answer his questions, rather than of providing an answer. He likely envisaged his duty as a teacher as that of making his pupils wiser to their own ignorance. Despite this, he is often pictured by Plato as infuriating his interlocutors, which many would see as a less than convincing method of persuasion. To boot, Socrates' method makes more sense as a means of securing a particular change in his hearers than as aimed at certain conclusions, and in this sense it is somewhat ad hominem. Aristotle tells us that Socrates believed the moral virtues to be forms of knowledge in such a way that when we knew what justice was, we would be just. There are two assumptions behind this idea. One is that what is good for man is plainly joined to what is good simpliciter, and the other is that goodness for man is simply getting what he wants. The key consequence of Socrates' equation of virtue and knowledge is that it means that men cannot do wrong by moral error. If one is vicious, it is due to an intellectual issue. The problematic moral character of Greek life at the time of Socrates arises from the fact that moral usage had ceased to be clear and consistent. So to discover unambiguous and practically useful moral concepts, one needs a different sort of inquiry. This is what Socrates' successors aim to undertake. On the one hand, Plato accepts that moral concepts are only intelligible against the backdrop of a certain sort of social order, and attempted to provide justification for this in terms of the order of the universe. On the other hand, the Cynics and the Cyrenaics seek to provide a moral code independent of society, tied only to an individual's choices and decisions as to make the individual's moral life self-sufficient. These philosophers, like Socrates, who imply that the contemporary morality is defected, are likely to be unwelcome to authority, and so it is a mark of Socrates' greatness that he was not surprised by his own fate and persecution.